Hello, everyone. This is the Mazzini Society report, and I'm Dennis Cerrotti. There's a fierce battle going on in our country right now over the issue of religious liberty. It's not a new issue, it's not a new controversy. It actually goes back to the origins of this country. When we think about religious liberty, the first figure that comes to mind is a man named Roger Williams. Those of us who live in New England know him well. Those who live outside of New England may not recall the name, except perhaps from a sixth grade history book. But Roger Williams is a very important figure in this country. It was Roger Williams whose writings were invoked when it came time to make the kinds of court decisions that eventually led to the freedom of everybody to have their own religion in this country and to have soul liberty, to have the ability to choose whatever religion they wanted to practice. These were mainly the results of Roger Williams, his life experience, and his advocacy and his writings. But today, Roger Williams is hardly referred to in the courts, and he certainly is not acknowledged by the public at large. Roger Williams is known as a famous Baptist, but most Baptists today don't care about Roger Williams. They don't embrace him, they don't embrace his ideas, except for those who live in the North and who are familiar with him. In the North, Roger Williams had a central place in the Baptist faith, and he's a very important figure even to this day, even as those figures have declined. So today we're going to go a little deeper into Roger Williams, and we have a special guest here. His name is Charles Hartman, Reverend Dr. Charles Hartman, and Charlie, as I call him, has been in ministry for 50 years as an American Baptist pastor. And he's not only an American Baptist pastor, but he's been teaching, I think it's for somewhere like 20 years at Roger Williams University in Rhode Island. So he's an expert in Roger Williams, and we're looking forward to have him share some ideas and some history, and we'll ask him some questions. So thank you for listening in, and here's Charlie. Thank you. So, welcome, Charlie, to the Mazzini Society report. I'm really delighted that you're here with us today, and we're going to be talking about a forgotten figure in American history. Well, you haven't forgotten him, but I think sometimes much of the rest of the country and perhaps the world have forgotten him. The name Roger Williams. And I just wanted to share a couple of items from my own childhood about Roger Williams. I grew up in an Italian Baptist church, and Roger Williams was almost at the level of saint in our Italian Baptist church. I would hear his name invoked repeatedly in sermons and in the educational programs of the church. He was like a fixture in the church because many of these people had fled Italy and they had fled the oppression of the Roman Catholic Church, and they came here and they wanted to have a freedom to have their own religious expression, their own religion. They didn't want to be imposed. They didn't want Catholicism imposed upon them, and the Baptist faith allowed them to experience that and to embrace that. And when they came here, they were so thrilled and so happy, as I've heard it, described to me by some of the people I was associated with, that they had this freedom. And so when these freedoms were ever challenged, these were the first people who jumped on board. For instance, when Mussolini came into power and reinvested the Roman Catholic Church with many of its previous powers, it was the Italian Baptists in this country who, raised a ruckus. And they raised a ruckus. They invoked the name of Roger Williams, and so he became. And aside from church, I went to school in Connecticut, and we always had Roger Williams in the textbook. I probably from about fourth grade, I can still remember the headliner. Roger Williams, father of religious liberty, and so he was a fixture. But I grew up in New England, and so but today, you know, I also had many years as a Baptist minister, as you did, not anywhere near as many as you. But you know, Roger Williams was
50 years now.
50 years. Congratulations! I didn't realize 50 years. So, but you know, of course, you know, Roger Williams was a guide. You know, when we began to talk about social issues, you know, of course, he was always in the background because he represented the principle of religious liberty, you know, which is really the undergirding of American Baptist faith. So, at any rate, without any further ado, I would really like to hear from you. You know, with all of your vast experience, and you know, you're not just as a minister in New England, but also as a teacher at Roger Williams University, which is incredible. And I think you probably teach one of two of the only courses on Roger Williams in the country. We don't know that for sure, but yeah, probably.
Yeah.
Well, we'll figure that out later. But at any rate, without any further ado, we're so happy to have you here today. I'll hand it over to you. So,
All righty. Thank you, Dennis, for thinking of me and for inviting me to share this opportunity with you to talk about a remarkable person who stands with all of the great people that we have learned about in school for many years. So I think I'll start out just kind of talking about where I began to be aware of Roger Williams. And that was when I was a young person many years ago. And we went to the American Baptist Assembly at Green Lake, Wisconsin. And the hotel, which had been built in the 30s and 40s for people coming up from Chicago to be at this beautiful lake, was taken over in 1946 by the Kraft family, Kraft Cheese, gave the assembly to the Baptists, and the hotel was named Roger Williams. Now, Roger Williams then became kind of this nebulous figure. Everybody said, well, Baptist started with Roger Williams. And to some extent, that's true. The next place that I really became more interested in Roger was when I came to be the pastor of the First Baptist Church in Swansea. The reason that started to connect the two things is the Swansea Church is the third oldest surviving Baptist church, and it was contemporary with Roger Williams. And so as I began to understand more and more the way that Baptists developed here in New England, I could see the significance of Roger, but I also began to understand that not everybody knows the story about Roger. Your friend who wrote the introduction to the Key to the Language of America starts out by saying Roger Williams, with a windmill in his head and flaming love in his heart, comes to us out of the virgin forests of New England. Yeah, evidently people who knew him during his lifetime found him to be kind of two things: friendly, open, engaged. But as Tustin says in his introduction to the Warren Church, he was conscientiously contentious. He would argue about all these things that to him were so significant in dealing with the human situation, the political situations, and certainly the ecclesiological situations. I think it's really important for us to understand the 17th century, out of which Roger emerged, being born 1603, 1604, someplace in there. But it was at the end of the Elizabethan period where the Protestant forces, Calvinistic and other reforming forces had pretty much shaped the world in terms of the tensions between the Roman Catholic Church and then the Church of England, and this ferment that kept boiling up. And it was in this ferment that Roger emerged as people began to be Puritans. Now, Puritan is a term that we use a lot. We use it pretty easily, but it can be so encompassing that it becomes kind of meaningless. Puritans, in the broadest sense, were anybody who wanted to reform the church. Church of England and certainly Roman Catholic Church had been corrupted, as Roger thought, by their associations, their relationships to the governing of states, to the in the English situation, to the monarchy, because the monarchy in England, as Roger began to emerge, was the head of the church as well as the head of the government. And it was in this tension between reformers and many of the political things that the wars ravaged Europe for many, many, many years. So Roger grew up into a world that was totally at odds with each other and full of violence. And he began to be that person who understood that the connection between church and state was the actual engine that begat the violence that he so vividly opposed. So he's in England. He goes to Cambridge, not Oxford, and he becomes intellectually aware of the Puritan struggles. But let me back up just a moment. He was a bright young man, obviously, and probably the connection that launched him into these significant positions in our history was his relationship with Edward Coke. It's C-O-K-E, but it's pronounced Cook. And Edward Coke was like the great barrister in England. He was your home is a castle and all that kind of stuff. But he was a judge in the arguments that some of the reformers were bringing as they went through the courts. And so Roger, who Coke had discovered doing some kind of strange shorthand, sitting in the back of the church one day, Coke came to him and said, "Can you do that for me?" And he became Coke's amanuensis. And the PhD dissertation by O'Toole said this is where Roger began to hear the arguments and the theologies of the Baptists. At this point, they were General Baptists as opposed to Calvinistic Baptists. But those were the people who, by this time, 1620s, had begun to say, no, the church and the state, that's a tension that we have to maintain. It's a separation. So Roger really gets these from the Arminian side of the Baptist gene pool. And he realized, after he had been in this situation for a while, that England was most likely going to have a war. I think he was keen enough to do that. So he came over here in 1630 to be in Massachusetts. Massachusetts was struggling with these same issues. They were really happy to see him. The people in Boston thought, oh, here comes a university-educated man who will help us establish the light on the hill to before all the nations and stuff. But Roger came because of this background that he had with some issues that the Puritan Congregationalists in Massachusetts were not comfortable with. The four issues, if I can remember them all, certainly the tension between church and state. He did not believe that the church could enforce religious behavior on individuals, which was the case in Massachusetts. The second was the issue of land. The land that he began to discover here in New England, he felt originally belonged to the native people. And so when the king just claimed that and dismissed the claims of the native people, he felt that was unfair. The third one was about oaths that he would take, that people were forced to take when they testified in court. And if somebody who he felt was not regenerated, that is, born again, who would swear by God to tell the truth, he thought that was blasphemy. So he was against that. And now I forget totally what the fourth one was. but those were sufficient to cause real problems with him. So he always stood against the conventional thinking about how church and state were to react to each other. And so he was asked to leave. He wasn't really asked to leave. They were about to arrest him. And one of the strange relationships in history between John Winthrop and Roger Williams. Winthrop had a lot of respect for Roger because he was well educated. He was able to argue. He was able to bring incredible reflection to the theological conversations of the day. But he disagreed with Roger on so much. As they were about to arrest Roger, he had John Winthrop had the compassion to warn Roger, and so Roger spent some time doing a little hike through the deep woods and the deep snow of New England, 1636, I think it was, and this is where Roger began to reap the benefits of his relationships to the native people. When the English began to reject him and want to persecute him, he went into the area of the Wampanoag and the Pokanoket people, and there he had already created a relationship, because after he left the ministry, he was a teacher a little bit in the Plymouth church, but after he left the ministry, he really supported himself by trading with the native people. And it was this commercial interest that motivated him to write the Key to the Language of America, in which he did this real anthropological, sociological reflection, study on the native people, which is one of our earliest resources to see what native life was like back then. It was that relationship, not only with the Pokanokets and the Wampanoag, but also translated to a good relationship with the Narragansetts. And the person who was most helpful to him was Canonicus. So as he's being thrust out of the bay, he becomes an ally to Canonicus, who, as he has to move further and further out, Plymouth said, you can't stay in Seekonk, that's where we live. You have to go across the river into what is, from the English point of view, the wilderness. So it was Canonicus, according to John McNiff, who said, well, you can have your city right here. And they put the city, which he called Providence later, right at the most easily crossed place in the Woonasquatucket River. So Canonicus, far from being a passive, oh gee, look at the English, aren't they great, was really trying to protect his own interest by putting an English person right at the point where if the English were to attack the Narragansetts, they would have to cross the river. So you have this guy who is held in esteem by the native people, and you have this same person who is being persecuted by the people that he basically believed to be his own people. So here he is in this situation, and now he has to create a government. And this is where I think he falls back on, and this is I take from the O'Toole book, he falls back on how do you organize a government? And this is where he begins to do things in a way that we would think of as more democratic. Certainly in the 17th century, not everybody had the vote. In the 17th century, the head of the household, if the head of the household owned land, could vote. So the town was then organized by the people who had come down from Salem to join with Roger. They'd known him when he was up there, and they began to form this government. And it sounded like a Baptist meeting when they all got in the same room and they began to say, well, who's going to be in charge? How do we make those decisions? And it's a vote by the head of the household. So that at the very core of the organization of the political structures, you have Roger falling back on this kind of congregational polity to form the towns, and then there were 4 towns originally. The problem that Roger had, though, was not limited just to forming a government. He was also in a place where everybody else wanted the land. And as he believed, the land belonged to the native people, and the English believed that the land belonged to the king through his divine right of being king. We began to see the machinations of the other colonies. Hartford, John Winthrop Jr. began to go, wow, gee, there's some nice land over there. And that Rhode Island area, the Narragansett area. Massachusetts wanted Block Island. They wanted Shawamet, which is now Warwick. So they're all kind of doing this aggressive thing to get his land. So he had to go back to England. He had to do the charter that would replace or that would be active instead of the Coddington charter. William Coddington, we'll throw him in here, came down from Boston with Anne Hutchinson and John Clark. And they had established themselves in Portsmouth and in Newport. And so early there were 4 towns, Warwick, Providence, Newport, and Portsmouth. They wanted to be a colony. Coddington wanted to be the governor for life. And so Roger had to go back to England and use his political connections that he had made through Cook to begin to find a charter that would then protect the character and the type of government that he wanted to have in Providence Plantations, Rhode Island and Providence Plantations, the name that still works. So he got very involved in actually this great diplomatic effort to get a charter. Well, people in Rhode Island liked him, and they thought he was really clever, and so they sent him over there and said, sure, we'll support you, we'll send you money, you just take care of the charter, get us all straightened out. But of course, they didn't. And so he went over in 1651 with John Clark, who, as it turns out, is the one who's going to do the heavy lifting to get the 1663 charter. Williams is there for 3 years and then has to come back, sells his trading post to Smith down in Cocomcusset, and then becomes the political leader. Meanwhile, in 1638, Roger is a member of the Baptist Church for about 3 months. So his bent for total purity, his inclination to be fully separated from any besmirched church, like the Church of England that was so corrupt, and the Catholics especially, drove him to leave the Baptists, who were Arminian there, and as far as I can tell, he never belonged to another church. Now, other people, Stanley Lemon says he preached to other people, but he did not preach to people inside a church. He preached to people outside the church. I don't know that any of them ever joined a church. I don't know what his relationship to the church was, but we know that he worked with John Clark to establish the political organization, which became the state, the colony, and then the state of Rhode Island, Providence Plantations.
Let me jump in here for a second.
Sure.
Okay, this point that you're making about him not being a Baptist except for 3 months, but the fact of the matter is that Baptists basically have owned him in a sense that they have always used him as a, he's like a saint in the Baptist church in many.
For some Baptists, remember there's 130 kinds of Baptists.
There are.
Southern Baptists now do not list him as a Baptist progenitor.
Yeah, well, this is interesting because there actually is some basis behind what the Southern Baptist position is. So doesn't that kind of set up a little bit of a contradiction in terms, because when we talk about religious liberty in this country and the laws that have been, have been passed, Roger Williams has always been a part of that whole discussion, at least up here in the north.
Yes, especially New England, where we're more familiar. I went several years ago to Monticello, and they have docents there. And they are saying, Thomas Jefferson, he's the one who really separated church from state. And he did it out of a sense of the Enlightenment, that it was reasonable and rational to keep these two institutions apart. When I said, well, what about Roger? They just kind of looked at me. And so I think the academic discussion is, well, where did these two ideas come together? And I think this is my theory anyway. There is a guy by the name of John Leland. And John Leland was a Baptist pastor. He was baptized in the Bellingham Church by Noah Alden. And then he became a pastor down in Virginia. And it was in that setting that he was in conversation with both with Madison and Jefferson. So there is this stream that we know influences him somewhat. Then he came back up to New England and he began to establish churches in Connecticut. And one of the churches in Connecticut wrote to Jefferson. And Jefferson's reply is the famous Wall of Separation letter. So the ideas flowed down through the Baptist stream of development until the ideas kind of bonked together in the First Amendment that Madison and Jefferson wrote. So, if you're going to say one is more important than the other, I don't think I could go there. I think these are two moments that flowed together in a political situation to insert into our political history an idea of radical proportions that two things, and I went through some of the books that I read. John Barry says that Roger is important for two things. One is by examining the relationship between church and state, and the other is the relationship between an individual and the state. And it's this liberty of conscience. Now, we understand in the 17th century, conscience really was more identified with your religious affiliations, whether you're a Puritan or a Catholic or whatever. But Roger saw that in a unique way that said we need more than simply to have a separation between these two institutions. We need to have such a robust sense of freedom that people can think what they want, can vote the way they want, can live the way they want. And it's this more radical liberty of conscience that I think now is the piece that we cannot afford to lose. Because in almost every situation where there's oppression or discrimination, there is one institution or one group of people who force their way of life on another set of people or individuals. And so it's when I teach my course, I said it's this liberty of conscience which transcends the religious and takes us beyond the political to a very existential point that we need to be free. We as human beings yearn to be free. That Roger made this happen in a particular way and was helped by John Clark, who also had some Baptist stuff going on with him, and actually created a state in which there were no religious expectations, there were no religious phrases or claims within the organizing documents. And that was the first time that it happened in human history.
I have one other question.
Okay.
What would Roger say about, the situation today in our country? I mean, really, when we get to talking about Roger Williams, we're talking about one of the most polarized times in, this country's history, the colonial
Yeah.
So
yeah.
What would he say about today? That's interesting. Would he have?
I think he would bring exactly the same issues. I think he would look at how we have reinvested religion into our political system, the extreme form being Christian nationalism. I think he would say, of course, all these issues, LGBTQ, women's rights, all of these things depend on a liberty of conscience. And if we do not grant that, if we don't find some way within our society to implement that, that we will not ever get there. The other thing that I think we want to remember, and one of the reasons why I think Roger was so adamant in his sense of purity, of leaving all the corruption of the church behind, was he really felt that Jesus was coming back and that was going to happen at any time. And so you had to be ready. Those of us who don't have that sense of imminent expectation, the parallel track is with John Clark. When he was in England working on the charter, he was involved, according to some scholars, in the Fifth Monarchy movement. The Fifth Monarchy movement was critical of the king, or of the Lord Protector Cromwell. Yeah, Cromwell, we'll get this. And so Cromwell began to say, well, those Baptists, they're not supporting us anymore, because Baptists were a big thing in Cromwell's army. The New Model Army had a lot of Baptists in it. So here's John Clark and some other people who are beginning to criticize Cromwell. And so it all came across because of this expectation that Jesus is going to come back and he will be that fifth monarch. We won't have to have any more after that. So it's oftentimes in periods of history in which there's a lot of conflict and a lot of turmoil, you get this end time stuff. We see it today. You know, I hear all these people going, "Oh, Jesus is coming back. Look at the signs," and I'm going, we've been saying that since Matthew was written, and that was about 75. And you know, it's more a product of our anxiety about what's going on in the world. So if you had a figure like Roger, one of the things that made Roger work as an influencer, all this new language, in the 17th century was he was educated and he was a clergy. And that is a status that we no longer appreciate.
No longer.
They were, you know, they were the elite of the society. That's why they could hobnob with princes and kings and stuff. And we have totally disregarded that now. It's just not a part of us anymore. The other thing which is concomitant with that is that everybody was religious. Everybody belonged to a church of some kind, you know, because after the Great Plague, this resurgence in the interest in the afterlife came back big time. So by the 17th century, why were these religious wars so vicious? Because it was all about what you're going to do for the next part of eternity after you die. So that sort of thing doesn't drive us anymore. So if you bring Roger back, you don't have that popular sense that, oh, here's a guy who is helping us understand our existential situation. Now we want to kind of reduce him to religious liberty. But I think his significance really takes us past simply religious liberty to this liberty of conscience, where you have a totally open society that can explore and invest and investigate all the kind of issues that are facing us now.
Well, thank you for listening into the conversation today. Just a couple of reminders. The first one, of course, is you know, hit the subscribe button and hit the like button. We hope you did enjoy the conversation. And if you have any comments, please leave them below. And please check our other videos out. We just published one on Thomas Morton, another hero from early American times. We really encourage you to take a look at that one. So have a good day. This is the Mazzini Society. Thank you.